have talked to Mike Riley on the radio a few times during election day, election night. And he's fascinating. You'll find him fascinating to tell about his relationship with the Kennedys. I don't know a lot about attorney Mike, but most of you are familiar with him. And if you're ready, Mike, we'll tune in to some lore about the Kennedys.
Well, first of all, I guess the views that I will state is I think I should be honest with you. I'm probably one of the few sort of almost an extinct minority in Jasper County is that I'm a Democrat. I have always been a Democrat, and I will be a Democrat unless something really bad happens until the day I die. I hope that's a number of years from now. I'm also a history major, or my training in college was history. I majored in history, and I think that irregardless of whether you like Robert Kennedy or the Kennedy family or Ted Kennedy, they have played a prominent part in the history of our country in the past 4 or 5 decades, even back to Joseph Kennedy, who I'm sure a lot of you know that was the ambassador to Great Britain. But history fascinates me, be it whether you're studying a Democrat or Republican or communist or Stalin or Hitler, because I think, just like we in our families learn, or we as individuals learn, is that you can learn from your mistakes. And that's the purpose of history. I think that's why we study history, is to learn from our mistakes and also learn from the things that we did right. And hopefully we will continue to do those things right. Maybe if we stray away from those things, we come back to them because they worked in the past. So I'm going to try and personalize this about Bobby Kennedy and also my friendship with Ted Kennedy. I'll tell you a little story is that in 1968, of course, I was much younger and I had a few gray hairs, but not like now. And I was 29 years old. And the only thing I knew about the Kennedys, in 1960, when I was in college, and you didn't get to vote until you were 21 then, and I turned 21 in October of that election year. I was a student at Indiana State, and Jack Kennedy, later to be President Kennedy, came on the campaign trail, and so I went and listened to him, and I'm Irish and he's Irish, and I'm Catholic and he's Catholic, and I think that and he was a dynamic speaker, and that really fired me up. And as I was leaving that, it was at the Vigo County and Terre Haute County Courthouse, and he spoke on one side of it, and his car was parked on the other side of it. And as I was leaving to go back to the dormitory, I came around the back side, and he was coming out the door, and he was shaking hands, and I got to shake his hand, never really realizing that 8 years later that myself personally, my life would be intertwined with the Kennedy family. If you'll recall the year 1968, the mood of the country, most of us were here, with the exception maybe of the cameraman, that we knew what the mood was. But if you go back, and just to refresh some of your recollections, if you go back to what we were going through, is we were going through the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War had started during Jack Kennedy's presidency, well, actually even during the Eisenhower years. And as the Vietnam War progressed, and then the assassination of President Kennedy, and when President Johnson was reelected overwhelmingly, he escalated the Vietnam War in a series of steps to escalate. And most people at that time thought the government said this is a just war and a good war, so it has to be so, because the government is good and they wouldn't lie to us, and so we're all for it. And as the years progressed, and Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General under his brother, he was a supporter of the Vietnam War, as was his brother, who was president. And so as the war kept escalating, people began to doubt it, and they began to question and ask, why are we here? And should we be here? And so in 1968, Johnson couldn't go out of the White House because of the protesters. Not that he couldn't, but that he chose to avoid that, and he kept escalating the war. And so the campaign of '68 was sort of born out of that dissatisfaction of mainly young people who were against the war. Some of the senators were starting to pick up on it. Our own, from a conservative state like we are, our own Vance Harkey had been one of Johnson's biggest supporters, and he was pulling away from Johnson, and he was making anti-Vietnam War speeches. So the mood of the country was one of unrest about this Vietnam, and many times it was young versus older citizens that were arguing. We also had, and I forget the exact year, but we had race riots, and I think when I first moved here, I think that Dr. Kinney and some other people organized sort of a little coffee club or a meeting group based upon some of on the Kerner Commission reports, and dealing with riots and dealing with the racial problems that we had. And that mood was still in 1968, as I believe it still exists today. We still haven't solved that one after many, many years of concern. So if you picture it, and Robert Kennedy in December of 1967 was asked by some reporter from the New York Times why wasn't he going to run, why wouldn't he run for the presidency? And he had a very strained relationship with President Johnson. When Johnson became president after the assassination of President Kennedy, there were some hard feelings. And if you read anything about Johnson, he had an ego bigger than this room. And they just couldn't get along. I think they probably just were two people who were destined never to get along. But Johnson and Kennedy said part of the reason I can't run because people will say that it's a personal thing between President Johnson and I, and another part is that because it will be so divisive for the Democrat Party. Bobby Kennedy loved the Democrat Party and he believed in it, and so he kept saying that he would not run, and he even made some statements that you know, I don't know of any event that would, foreseeable event that would cause me to run. There were a group of liberals, you know, again, not a popular term, and especially not Jasper County, but there were a group of liberals that were encouraging someone to run, and they finally talked Eugene McCarthy into running for the presidency. And on the Republican side, Nixon was clearly the front runner. George Romney was running, who was the governor of Michigan. He withdrew before the New Hampshire primary, so that it looked like it was going to be Nixon, or Nixon by a clear choice was the front runner on the Democrat side. Johnson and McCarthy ran in New Hampshire. Right prior to that, Bobby had, he was being pressured to run, and you know, I've met politicians all my life, and they always say, when they decide to run for office, well, the reason I'm running is because all my friends are forcing me to. I've always thought that was so much bullshit. They run because they want to run, and they drag their friends along behind them to support them. But you know, Bobby was being contacted by people to run, and he resisted that. Shortly before the primary in New Hampshire, which was March 12th, he started seeing that Eugene McCarthy was really making headway, and they had, when he started, the Johnson camp put out the fact that he'd be lucky to get 10% of the vote. Polls started showing that he was moving, and as it wound up, Johnson got 49.4%, and McCarthy got 42 in some points percent, and he won 20 out of 24 delegates. After that, on March 12th, Senator Kennedy felt like he could run and not be accused of going after President Johnson personally. On Saturday, March 16th of 1968, he announced in the Senate caucus room where his brother had 8 years before. That's, from that announcement is how I got involved with Bob Kennedy. I was, you know, and you don't like to bore people with your own personal background, but just to give you an idea how I, at age 29, got into a position where I could help him, was that I was born and raised in southern Indiana, in Greene County, in a coal mining community called Linton. Today it's the same size as Rensselaer. My father was a coal miner. He'd gone through the Depression. His father was, at one time had been wealthy, but was an alcoholic, had left home, and my father raised his 5 brothers and sisters. He was a well-read man, but never had the opportunity to complete his college education because of that fact. And in Greene County was as Democrat as Rensselaer and Jasper County are Republican. And he was a Democrat's Democrat because he thought that FDR was the greatest person in the world because of the Depression and the suffering that went on in the Depression. So as a kid, you know, you don't pay attention to what your parents say about politics or something, but you learn a lot through what my dad used to call osmosis, which was sitting on your ass and listening to adults talk. And, you know, from that, I don't think that there was ever a time in my life, except for one brief stint when I came home from college one time, that I ever thought about being a Republican. I do remember that. I went to Indiana State, came home one weekend, thought, was talking to my dad, and I said, well, you know, I saw some organization I thought I might join. It's the Young Republicans Club. And after 3 hours of taking me through the history of the Depression and of what his other hero other than FDR was John L. Lewis, who was president of the United Mine Workers. And after taking me through all that, I thought, well, if I love my father and I love my mother, and I'd rather be a Democrat than not be able to come home. And secondly, he was also paying for my college education. I went to, then when I graduated from Indiana State, and I got involved in the Young Democrats there, and then I went to law school, and I went to school in the evening and worked during the day. And one of the jobs that I would take a job if it paid $10 more a week, I'd take the job. I mean, I knew I was going to be a lawyer, and I needed to make more money. I had a child, was married, and had a child then. And so I got a job with state government and wound up as the personnel director for the state revenue department. And at that time it was all political. I mean, if the Democrats were in, they fired all the Republicans and hired Democrats. If the Republicans were in, they fired all the Democrats and hired Republicans. Our state has always been, until in light of Supreme Court cases in the last 20 years or so, our state has always been a very tightly organized political state from both parties until probably 76. If you had a job for the state, you paid 2% of your salary to your political party. And either, whichever political party was in control of the state house. The county organizations were the same way. A very controlled, in matter of fact, we were probably one of the last states to do away with that. So we had strong party organizations. But as personnel director, I had, because you had to have political clearances from precinct committeemen and ward chairman and county chairman, before I could hire those people of necessity, I got involved in politics, and I loved it. I thought it was a lot of fun. Got out of law school, ran for presidency of the Marion County Young Democrats, which was an organization of 300 or 400 people. It wasn't like today, the political organizations, they had some clout. People got interested in it, sometimes for self-serving reasons of getting a job. But I won that, and then I ran for state Young Democrat president and won that, and was serving my office, that term of office, in 1968, which brings me to how I was involved in the Kennedy campaign. And after seeing his announcement on TV, I went back to, I was in Gary at a Young Democrat function, and went back to Indianapolis and talked to a friend of mine who was a lawyer who was the Democrat county chairman, and said, boy, Bobby Kennedy really turns me on. I'd sure like to help him. You know, if anybody's asked, I'd like to help him. And that's all I said. Unbeknownst to me, they had, after he announced, one of the states they were considering and running in the primary was Indiana. And after saying this to him, I didn't think too much more about it. That was on Monday. On Wednesday, I'm in my law office, and I was practicing with two other young guys. We had a partnership, and my secretary buzzed me, and she said, Senator Ted Kennedy's on the phone. And you know, I thought, oh well, who's this? One of my friends putting me on, and this voice comes on the phone, and I'm ready to say, well, you know, who in the hell is this? And the voice keeps talking, and I'm thinking, boy, that guy sure sounds like he has a Boston accent. And what the message was, that he wanted me to help his brother in Indiana, and that he wanted me to head up the campaign to get him on the ballot in Indiana, on the primary ballot. And about halfway through, and Teddy does have this, as I'm sure you've seen him on TV, has this neat Irish brogue, and about halfway through the conversation, he says, well, I bet you don't believe I'm Ted Kennedy. And I said, he said, I bet you believe somebody's imitating. And I said, well, that thought has crossed my mind. and then he says, well, I'm going to have Bobby's press secretary call you in a few minutes, because I mean, I wasn't so brazen to say, well, who in the shit is this? And so I had gone along, but did so somewhat reluctantly, because I was afraid I was going to have egg all over my face, and one of my friends would start laughing. And so I was called by a secretary, press secretary, a guy by the name of Frank Mankiewicz, and then I knew it was real, in that they had asked me to do this. Later on, I found out, you know, I mean, my ego was pumped up. I'm thinking, God, Senator Ted Kennedy's calling me, the press secretary's calling me. They must have recognized that I've got to be the greatest politician in Indiana, and I'm young. And well, I found out really why they called me was that because they'd been turned down by every senior party politician that they'd contacted, because Roger Brannigan was governor, and the state chairman was a guy by the name of Gordon St. Angelo, and they were committed to President Johnson. And any politician that had any sense did not go against the sitting president. It would have been the same thing as the Republicans going against Ronald Reagan when he was president, or George Bush when he was president. At 29 years old, you know, I was working, and I didn't have a job that depended on political patronage, and plus I was done. You know, I thought you always went for people that you liked. And I found out in politics that's not necessarily the case. And through that, I can say that my contacts with the Kennedys helped change my life and mowed a lot of what I later came to value in life. But at that point in time, I was 29 years old, trying to find out, trying to sort my way through what kind of person I should be and what I really wanted to do with my life. At the time, you also have to keep in mind that Indiana was and is a very conservative state. It was more so probably in 1968 than it is now. We did have 2 Democrat senators. We had Birch Bayh and Vance Harkey. We did have a Democrat governor at that time, which was Roger Brannigan. All of those things happened because of the landslide that carried Lyndon Johnson into the White House in 1964. Our state, we had never had any racial problems in Indiana. I mean, I'm not saying we didn't have any problems. We did not have any riots in Indiana. We were not perceived as total rednecks. That we lived and tried to get along at that particular time and work side by side, but I'm sure there were ill feelings on both the sides, but it wasn't as out in the open as it might have later become. As I told you, we had a strong Indiana, both parties had a very strong political organization. So it wound down that in telling Senator Kennedy, Senator Ted Kennedy, that I would help, you know, I got on a roller coaster that a kid from Linton who hadn't been around a whole lot, that I'll never forget. They sent in a political operative who turned out to be a wonderful guy and is still a friend of mine. He's a lawyer from Boston by the name of Gerard Doherty. And he had ran Teddy's first Senate campaign. And he flew in and we met him at the airport. And I was thinking today of the people that I took out there. And these were all young guys and all friends of mine. And what they have done since then. One was Bill Schreiber. He presently is Lieutenant Governor O'Bannon's political guy in his race for the governorship. Another was Louis Mahern, who became a state senator and was a candidate for mayor and against Steve Goldsmith the first time he was elected. Another's one of my best friends, Ed Tracy, who is a lobbyist and was the Democrat chairman. Phil Hayes from here in Rensselaer, the Hayes family. Phil was there that night. He was just out of law school and went down to Evansville and practiced law and is still there. He later became congressman from the 8th District. And that was his entree into politics. One of the other people that later helped in the campaign and was his start in politics, had never done anything politically, was Floyd Fithian, who later became our congressman and then ran for U.S. Senator. We met Mr. Doherty at the airport, and he laid out what we had to do. By then, it was probably March 17th. And in Indiana at that time, and it's that way now, you had to get 500 signatures of registered voters from each congressional district to get on the primary ballot. And you had to have those on file by March 28th of that particular year. So the political dilemma they had is they couldn't say Bobby was going to run in Indiana until they had all the signatures, because if he said, I'm going to run in Indiana, and then we couldn't get the signatures, it would greatly embarrass him. So that's what we did for 10 to 12 to 14 hours a day for those 10 or 11 days. Gerard Doherty was a master of organization. He took over my law office, drove my law partners crazy, but we had a lot of fun, and we got people involved from all over the state. In the meantime, the media, the national media, knows that Bobby's going to come to Indiana, and they know that we're trying to put these things together. And, you know, I mean, here one day you see Walter Cronkite on the news, and the next day he's calling, you know, and I'm thinking, God, I'm really hot shit. I mean, what more could you do? Huntley, Brinkley, I was like becoming their buddies. They'd call every day. And New York Times reporters, Wall Street Journal reporters, and all these people are in town because Indiana was a hot story. I didn't know this, but the Kennedy people had decided that Indiana was to Bobby what West Virginia was to John Kennedy. And West Virginia was the state that turned John Kennedy's campaign around. It was a crucial state. It showed that a Roman Catholic could win in a state that had very few Roman Catholics, and that a Catholic Democrat could win in a state that was poor and had very little industry except mining. Bobby needed to prove that he wasn't this ruthless, mean individual that had been depicted, and that he could appeal to conservative people and win conservative states, and they picked Indiana. The night of March 28th, he filed. And on that particular night, that's a picture I have hanging on my wall. On that night, we finally, even though we had to sue the county clerk in Lake County, who was for Governor Brannigan and wouldn't certify our signatures, we sued him and got a federal court to issue a mandate order. We finally had 500 signatures from every congressional district. Bobby came to town and was going to file, and did file in the Secretary of State's office. He was supposed to be there at 7 o'clock, and about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, people started showing up, and a lot of them were young people that we carted in by buses. And so we figured we'd have about 1,000 young people there. People just came from everywhere, and there were estimates of the crowd between $5,000 to $10,000, or 5,000 to 10,000 people. The Republicans said 5, we said 10. The Johnson people said 2. But, and I noticed that there's been a big controversy about the crowd count in the march that they just recently had, the Million Man March, and that's been on TV and everything. And it's funny how things change, but they don't change. You know, I mean, people are always disputing crowd count. I will remember that, you know, now when you see a presidential candidate surrounded by Secret Service, even the candidates are. Bobby comes in, I had gone out to the airport and rode in with him and met him for the first time, and he comes in and we had like 3 or 4 cars, but he was in a convertible. And we pulled up to the State House entrance. And I mean, there's just masses of people, and there was something about him. He was a very shy man, but there was something about the Kennedy mystique that people just wanted to touch him. And he had one guy, one dedicated man that I got to be friends with by the name of Bill Berry. He was an ex FBI agent who was a bank security officer that when Bobby announced, and he had been a friend of Bobby's when he was in the Justice Department, and when he announced he quit his job, and he said, I'll go with you and I'll provide security. One guy, not a very big guy, stocky guy. And I thought those people were going to kill Bobby. I mean, good people, just crushing him in there. And this guy would just put his arms out, and Bobby'd walk facing people, and he'd keep by his arms, he'd keep people away. They ripped off his cufflinks, they ripped his shirt, and so when he met, and I'm following along behind, when we made it to the State House and then to the Secretary of State's office, he was a mess. He looked awful, and I thought, God, I mean, are we in for a month of this? And it turned out that we were in for a month of that. There was something that he did that touched people, and I never, he was not imposing physically as his brother was, and he had sort of buck teeth, and he used to laugh about it because I never did this, but some of his closer friends would kid him about having rabbit teeth, and they would call him Rabbit, stuff like that. And he was not an impressive speaker. He was slight, and he talked real fast, and he talked choppy. But there was just something about him that just impressed me, seeing him the first time. Then from there we went to the Murad Hotel, where it was sort of that's on North Meridian. It's now an apartment complex in Indianapolis, and he had a press conference and he gave a speech as to why he was filing in Indiana. And after that was over, and I still have that, is he autographed it to me and gave it to me, and it's a thing I treasure. It was the first time that I met him after all of this was done. We went up to the room, and some of the people that had worked so hard, I'd made arrangements to meet him in his room, and the thing that came across was his great sense of humor. I mean, I can't remember anything he said particularly, but he could make fun of himself. And I always thought that one of the things that I think I've learned over the years is that if we can't make fun of ourselves, if we can't laugh about some of the stupid stuff we do, then it's always been my belief that's a person that I'm probably not going to want to hang around with a whole lot. And he immediately came across as that kind of person. Right after that, maybe the next day, Teddy flew in. You know, Teddy and I have been, from the time I met him until today, became friends. And, you know, when you're talking to anybody about Teddy, there's strong feelings both ways. And Teddy is a neat person, he's a compassionate person. He's done some things, made some mistakes in his life, but he suffered through those. But he's a real wonderful guy, and I think he's a dedicated patriot. You can disagree with the things he stands for, but he has fought hard for the things he believes in. I had an interesting, I think it was June or July, it's funny how kids get you in, how your kids get you into things. My son Brendan, who's 15, last year was going out to Washington, D.C. on that trip that they 8th graders get to go if they pass this test and stuff. And so we go to a meeting, and George Cover, who is as much a Republican as I am a Democrat, was at this meeting for parents, and he said, well, he said, Senator Coates can't get our group in the White House on the White House tour. And so he says to me, well, you got all these Democrat connections, why don't you get this done? Well, as competitive as I am, I'm not going to let George Cover think that I can't get that done. As it turned out, I couldn't, but it wasn't for lack of trying. And so I called Teddy's office and talked to his administrative assistant, another Irish guy by the name of Paul Donovan. And they called the White House, and then I found a friend of mine knew a lawyer who knew in Arkansas, who knew the lady that scheduled this. And so I had all these people, and then I called the governor's office, and I had to, Indiana, if you didn't know, has a representative, a paid person that stays in Washington, D.C., and is sort of the state's lobbyist. In every state, I found out, has one of these people. So I had all these phone calls going back and forth, and then the Oklahoma bombing occurred, and the security in the White House was tightened up, and you know, the deal fell through. But out of that, Teddy's office called me back and said, well, we've done this favor for you. Will you hold a fundraiser for Teddy in Indianapolis? And I said, wait a minute. My kid didn't even get in the White House. So I did have a fundraiser in June for Teddy, and he came into town, and I had it at the house of a wonderful guy, and has been a longtime friend of mine, a lawyer by the name of Buddy Yosha. And Buddy's been very successful, and he has this home that's is a mansion. You know, I mean, it's one of the finest homes I've ever been in. And at one time I tried to get him to go out to Ted Kennedy's house for a fundraiser for him out in Washington. And Buddy says, no, I can't go, but I want you to look at his house and see if his house is as nice as mine. Because Buddy is very proud of his home as well. He should be. I think it's about a 15,000 square foot home. So I was telling Ted that on the way into the airport that what Buddy had said, and Buddy's sort of a character, and he's a lot of fun. And so we have the cocktail party, and then I introduce, and the governor was there, and I introduced the governor, and the governor introduces Senator Kennedy, and he got up and he thanked Buddy and Rosie for their graciousness in their home, and he says, and he relates this story, and he says, well, Buddy, all I've got to say in comparing our homes is that my daddy should have worked harder. Meaning that all his wealth, all his money comes from his father. He also said to Evan By, he says, you know, Evan, I knew your father Birch, and know your father Birch, and matter of fact, they were in a plane crash together, and Birch pulled him from the plane. And he went on, and he says, the only bad part, Evan, you got elected governor and you traded on your family name. and so Teddy is, I mean, he's got a great sense of humor. As I said, we became friends from that time and sort of hit it off. And he spent a lot of time on that campaign. As the campaign started and he gets on the ballot, Bobby gets on the ballot, he's flying all over the country everywhere, and Teddy spent some time here, and then the people started coming in from, I mean, there were people, probably they had at one time 400 or 500 people that came from all over the country to help on this campaign. The ones I know that, I mean, I met a lot of wonderful people, but the ones that you might recall, Ken O'Donnell, who was President Kennedy's appointment secretary, Pierre Salinger, who was his press relations guy, Larry O'Brien, who was Postmaster General, and then quit that to work for Bobby and came here, and then he became NBA commissioner. Author George Plimpton, I don't know if any of you read his books. He's the guy that likes it. I mean, he wrote a book about being a Detroit Lion. I forget the name of it. He was a good friend of the Kennedys, and all these people are camping out in my law office. You know, consequently, I probably didn't earn very much money those 2 months, and probably lost some clients, especially if they were Republican. So, and it was a lot different time then. In that political financing was a lot different. There was a lot of cash that changed hands, both parties. I mean, you didn't have to report campaign contributions. You did not have to list every contributor that gave $100 or over. It was just a different environment. And I can remember, and the Kennedys were wealthy. You know, I don't know where they got their money. One day I'm sitting in my office, and this little guy smoked a long cigar. His name was Leo Vassar. And I never knew what he did, but I knew he had to be important because I had lunch with him one day, and he handed the credit card to the waitress, and it was Joseph Kennedy Sr. American Express card. So I figured, well, this guy's got some connection. And he comes in, and he was a New Yorker, and he's fast talking, and he tells me, and I can't talk fast, so I can't imitate him, but he tells me to go with him, that he's going to fly to Chicago. And we fly to Chicago, and we land at that Meigs Air. We have a small plane, fly to Chicago, land at Meigs Field. He goes in to the terminal, and says, "Just wait here, kid." And he just went, and he told these wonderful stories about the Kennedys and Joe Kennedy, and he comes back out and he's carrying 2 suitcases. He gets back on the plane and we fly in, and I said, "Well, why do we do that?" As we're driving in from our airport in Indianapolis. And he said, "We had to pick up a cash inflow, cash influx." And he opens the suitcase, and you know, for a kid from Linton that never saw a $100 bill, I mean, there was more money there than I ever thought I'd ever earn in my life, and perhaps I never have. But that's the way that those campaigns were ran. You would all, on election day, I know that they would pay the precinct workers in cash, and both parties did. And they did that probably until until all the post-Watergate election reforms. Every precinct committeeman in Indianapolis used to get $100 on election day. Those things now would get you thrown in jail real quick. Well, I think you take a break, and I probably talked over it for what?
Yeah, take a break.
10 minutes?
That's, yeah.
Okay.
Break and good.
Many stories. I have to tell a Mike Riley story. Some months ago, my son Peter is finishing up law school. Actually, it must have been a couple of years ago. Time flies. Anyway, I went over to ask Mike if he might use a partner or might use some of his connections to help my son Peter get a start in law. And I start to expound about Peter's background and his capability, and Mike stops me. He says, "Jim," he says, "I've only got one question. He's not no goddamn Republican, is he?" So speaking of Republicans, I'd like to introduce Jerry Hoover, who's got what I think is really a pleasant surprise. You want to come on up here, Jerry?
Well, Mike, I don't want to cut into your time, but
Oh, that's all right.
But here's what, we do have a little program at the November the 16th, and Dr. Kenny is going to try to, include that into this course. But on November the 16th, we're planning to have a government day at St. Joseph's College. And we invited originally 7 counties, 17 schools, right around Rensselaer. 5 of the schools have declined to come. And so now, I have called recently, like the last couple of days, and we've got 4 or 5 schools from Lake County coming. There'll be somewhere around, I think, 1,300 kids, seniors in high school, that will come to St. Joseph's College. Now, the main speaker will be Senator Luther. And then we expect to break the kids down into state representatives and state senators for an hour, and then county government for an hour. And so that'd be the recorder and the sheriff and the auditor and so forth and so on. So I'm just making you aware of that, because it will be open to the public. And again, November the 16th, that's 2 weeks from today. And I think it'll be a nice program for kids. One other thing, it will be student-oriented. You will not see any old person. I call them old persons. The teachers will not do introductions. All office holders will be introduced by students, and all office holders who attend will be escorted by students, and the question and answer sessions that we have scheduled for that will be student-oriented. It will be student-led, and we think that it makes a lot more work for the teachers, but the kids learn more if you got the students involved to that degree. So that's what we have on tap, and providing the senator shows up and continues to keep the schedule, I think it's going to happen. So that's enough said, okay? And you're all certainly welcome.
And we will, anybody that wants to attend that as one of their 6 sessions and take some notes, just like you've done for this class, that hearing Senator Lugar certainly can substitute for any of these other sessions. And I think that would be really something. Back to the Democrats.
I might say, wait a minute, I really, as a teacher, I really kind of do not like being tabbed as a Republican, because I've voted for about as many Democrats in my life as I have Republicans, and so I'd like to be thought of as a bipartisan person at this point.
I hope you don't want me to make a similar statement. I have a Dick Lugar story that was involved during the Kennedy campaign. The night of Martin Luther King's assassination, I had, during the Kennedy campaign, as one of my functions was to set up rallies, election rallies, mainly in the Marion County, Indianapolis area. And so we had agreed to, or we had planned on having an election rally in the, at 16th and Broadway. There's a park there. And if you know Indianapolis, that's close to downtown, and that's a heavily black area, and it was geared to a rally that in the black community. So that was set up like 3 or 4 days before April 4th. And in the afternoon, we received word that Martin Luther King had been killed in Memphis. And Bobby was, I think, in Mississippi, and so we, you know, it was before the modern communications, or ultra-modern communications for me, where every plane seat has a phone. I mean, it was a big thing to get a hold of somebody on a plane in 1968, but we did, and informed him of this, and I was talking to him. I mean, he had heard about the assassination, but I was talking to one of his aides about whether we should have this rally in the black community, because nationwide they were talking about riots, and in many cities that particular night there were riots. Dick Lugar was mayor of Indianapolis, and he called me. And he said, I don't want you to have that, I don't want you to have that rally, because we're afraid that violence will break out. And so we were negotiating back and forth, and Dick Lugar at that time said, you know, and I had talked to the senators' people, and they said, no, we're going to go ahead with it. You tell Dick Lugar to take a flying leap. And so in the meantime, I'm in contact with Mayor Lugar. Finally, he was becoming exasperated with me, and said that he was going to have fire trucks run fire hoses across the street, all the places, to keep us from getting in there, and he was going to post police officers to make sure that nobody ran over the fire hoses, and that's a crime if you didn't know that. And so it was sort of a face-off between Lugar and myself. He finally decided that, you know, that we were threatening to have the press there and everything else. And that was the night that Bobby made a speech that what's funny is how things come back, and how, as I look at this, sometimes how my life has been intertwined with the Kennedys. We dedicated, or they dedicated, the Indiana Pacers and some other people, myself included, raised some money to fund a memorial at the Broadway Park. And in May, President Clinton came, and Senator Kennedy, Ted Kennedy, and they had a ceremony at that park. And I don't know if you've seen the pictures of the sculpture, but there's a picture of Robert Kennedy on one side of this walkway, a statue, bronze carving, whatever, sculpture. And on the other side is Martin Luther King, and they're reaching out to each other with their hands. And it was dedicated, I think, in the middle of September. Anyway, that particular night, it was a night quite like tonight, chilly and rainy and nasty weather. And Bobby probably gave the finest speech that he had given during that campaign on that night. And the words of that are on the memorial in Arlington National Cemetery, on the wall that they built where he's buried. I have to apologize a little bit to you in that I meant to say at the start of this is that, you know, I'm used to being interrupted by judges who usually tell me to shut up, and so that doesn't throw me off course too much. So if you have any questions or want to make any comments, feel free to, and I'll try and leave some time for people to do that. The other thing, one of the things that I remember about that campaign is, out of many things, but one of the things that I thought was real funny is that Bobby loved kids and dogs, and he had this dog that he had with him all the time, you know, for his free time. And he was staying at the hotel downtown that's been destroyed, but it was across from the clay pool called the Lincoln Sheridan Hotel, I believe, on Washington Street. He was supposed to go to a TV taping at a plumbing business, and there were going to be a bunch of businessmen around, and they were going to ask him questions, and he was going to make this TV commercial out of it. And I'd set that up, and usually, you know, you're supposed to know where you're going. Well, I knew where this plumbing business was if we left from the Lincoln Hotel. I did not know where it was after what happened. He came out that morning, and he's got his dog, and he's got this lawyer from San Francisco, really a nice guy who traveled with him and did a lot of his speech writing, by the name of Fred Dutton. And so we were going to, you know, that had a couple cars with other staff people and everything, and he comes out and he says, "What a great day, let's walk a little bit and have these cars follow us." And so we started walking on Washington Street, and we told the drivers we're going to walk down this street. The senator wants to walk, so it's myself and Senator Kennedy and this Fred Dutton and the dog Freckles. And we're walking down Washington Street, and we keep walking, and we keep, finally he says, well, I said, "Senator, we're running late." He was always late, I mean, always late. And so I said, well, you know, we better get there, and I keep looking around for these cars that are supposed to pick us up when we finish this walk, and somehow they'd gotten lost. And so we're walking, and we keep walking, and we keep walking, and finally I said, well, they're not going to come. And, you know, he could also turn a phrase, and with not probably the cleanest language in the world, and I think probably the kindest thing that he said that particular day was, "You dumb shit." But he was laughing, and so I'll never forget it. He says, well, let's just flag down a car and have him take us to this plumbing place, wherever it was. So I'm out in the street, and I'm waving at cars, and people are going by, and this guy pulls up, and this is the honest to God truth. It was a 58 Edsel, and he goes, "God damn, Senator Kennedy!" And I said, well, we need a ride to this plumbing place. And I tell him, and all he keeps saying is, "God damn, Senator Kennedy!" So we get in this car, and I remember I had on a light-colored spring suit. It was fairly warm that day, and we get in this car, and the parts of the Edsel are on the back seat, greasy and everything else. So this Fred Dutton, who's a pretty dapper guy, and I always thought that I was a pretty dapper guy, and we have to sit on this grease and these parts, and of course the senator gets the front seat. And this guy had less of an idea of how to get there than I did. So about a half hour later, after much discussion, we finally arrive at the place, and we walk in, and there's all these business people that were going to be part of this panel. And Bobby walks in, and he goes, I apologize for keeping you men here. I know you're busy. And one of them was president of this big corporation, and another one was a big home developer. Everything. He says, you know, Mike's a lawyer, and he knows where the courthouse is, but he doesn't know where plumbing businesses are. And the other thing that I remember another time, it's probably during this campaign, I spent a lot of time away from home, and was not really in good shape with my wife, who she and I have since divorced, and I always thought perhaps it was part of the Kennedy campaign, but we had a meeting set up in our house. We lived on Washington Boulevard, and we just purchased this house. Had the living room, had a huge living room, and had just had it freshly painted and redecorated, and so he wanted to have a TV commercial with a group of housewives. And so in that, I did a lot of that, and I set that up in my own home. Little did I know that they would hang all these lights with masking tape on the ceiling and on the fresh paint, and which did not put me in very good stead after this thing was over. But I remember that he was, Bobby, who was oistly, I mean oistly, behind schedule, chewed his wife out because Ethel was like 15 minutes late. And he said, pulled me aside, and he said, "Why can't women be on time?" I said, "Senator, you're never on time. She's always here." He goes, "Oh yeah, that's probably right." Ethel was and is a very gracious person, and how she ever kept her sanity during that campaign. You know, just the crowds everywhere he went were just fantastic. He probably lost every set of cufflinks. I mean, it was big to wear cufflinks back then, and he probably lost every set that he ever had. I recall so many things about that campaign and have made so many notes, but I'll try and go through them a lot quicker than I have been. But one of the things that I remember as I've gotten older and been able to think about this is that, you know, what kind of person was Bobby Kennedy? He had a press image of some people in the press would call him ruthless. I never ever saw that. I know that during this campaign, he personally, you know, not an aide, not anybody else, would call. I mean, he called my wife 3 or 4 times and just said, I know your husband's away from home a lot. I know that it causes you some distress. It's for a good cause. He'd do that, and not just to me, but to other people who were working on the campaign. He was very, very thoughtful. As I mentioned before, he had a great sense of humor. He was touched by, he believed that no one in this country should ever go hungry. And he was very touched by some of the places that he went. Not in the world, but right here in this country. And I remember he and I had a long conversation about one of the saddest things that he ever saw were hungry black kids in Mississippi. And he was talking about, you know, I've been all over the world and I've seen poverty, but I have never seen poverty in a nation that's so wealthy, and we can't let that happen. And he believed that. And he believed that he was very fortunate and born into wealth, and that he didn't do a thing to earn it, and he had always lived a wonderful life, but that he owed back to people who were less fortunate because of his father's wealth. He just, you know, he was a fun guy to be around. He had a lot of witty observations. One of the observations I made back then was, it was politically correct to refer to African Americans as blacks then, and his bridging of that gap. You know, poor white people loved him, poor black people loved him. He could bridge between the races, and you could see that. And you could tell that in the election results in Indiana. He went through the state, he did a lot of fun things. He rejuvenated the Wabash Cannonball, and he took that train and he campaigned from the back of that train. He threw some receptions. I remember a reception that we had in Indianapolis in the Lincoln Hotel, and Rose Kennedy was there. And I can remember our headquarters were across the street from it, and I can remember looking out the window on a Sunday evening that all it was shaking hands with people as they came through to meet Rose Kennedy, and Bobby was there, is that the people were lined up from that hotel. which is now the Hyatt Regency, way past the convention center, which is now the convention center. Of course, none of that was there, just waiting. I mean, I had never seen a person, and I have never seen since, a politician who could draw the crowds that he drew. And, you know, he was not comfortable he would not really be comfortable in a group this small. He was very comfortable in a large group. The night, election night, he won that election in Indiana by 42%, and Brannigan had 31%, and McCarthy, and I might have the figures a little bit wrong, but McCarthy had 27%. You know, being Irish, you have, and if you're in politics, and if you have a competitive nature, when people slight you in life, you take it, but you always figure out there'll be a time that you can get them back. And when I was elected Marion County Young Democrat president, I didn't know anything. I went to a political function in French Lick, Indiana, and Senator Vance Harkey was there. And Harkey was the first guy back in the 60s that developed the idea of having a reception line, and as you went through it, he took a Polaroid picture of you shaking his, or his staff did, of you shaking his hand, and then his staff would give that to you later on. And like I said, I'm a kid from Linton. I'd never met a U.S. Senator, and I get invited to go to this function, and Harkey's there. And as I'm going through the line, you know, I'm impressed. Like government, like politics, and this is a big deal for me. And as I go through the line, and maybe I did something to offend him, I didn't think I did, but he shakes my hand and he says, "Why are you here?" And I said, "Well, I'm president of Marion County Young Democrats." And then he said to me, "Well, you've got a long way to go, boy." And so, you know, I go through the line and I think, well, what an asshole to say that. I didn't do anything to deserve that. I wasn't drunk, I wasn't rowdy, or any of that. So Harkey, Senator Harkey, and I had occasion to see him not too long ago. He's a lawyer practicing in Washington, D.C., and he remembers what happened the night Bobby Kennedy got elected. Harkey, all of a sudden, was not around the campaign, but he was around the night that Kennedy won. He didn't do anything to help us during the course of the campaign, but he was there because the press was there, the national press. So we're up in the room celebrating the victory, and I'm standing next to Senator Kennedy, and Senator Harkey comes up to him and says, "Well, you know, you're going down to make your victory speech." And he said, I'll be happy to appear on the podium with you. And Bobby said, "No," he said, "I don't want you to do that." He said, "The people that my campaign manager, Mike Riley's going in this, the real campaign manager was the guy from Massachusetts, Gerard Darty." He said, "They're the only two I want to go up on the podium with me to celebrate this." As we're walking out with the senator, Harkey's behind us, and he's convinced that he's going to go on the podium, and he says something to me, and I said, "Well, you got a long way to go, Senator." And so that, you know, only an Irish person would enjoy something like that. And Harkey still remembers that he didn't get to go on the podium before the national news media. After that evening, the next time that I never saw Senator Robert Kennedy alive in California. He was assassinated. I had watched his victory speech, and then it was real late in the morning, or early in the morning, and had turned it off and was getting ready to go to bed. And someone called and said, turn your TV back on. I think it was 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning here. I attended his funeral and stood watch the night before. They had different people stand with the casket for about half hour or so. And the next morning at the funeral was in St. Patrick's Cathedral. I remember Teddy, I mean, how he ever had the guts to get up and deliver his brother's eulogy. I don't know, but one of the most touching things that he said, and it sort of summed up, I think, those of us throughout the country that loved Bobby Kennedy. He said, "My brother need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life, to be remembered simply as a good and decent man who saw wrong and tried to right it, saw suffering and tried to heal it, saw war and tried to stop it." And when you look back on those words, and as I was thinking about talking tonight, you know, I wish somebody sometime would say that about me. And I mean, for all of us, if you can substitute woman for man, because isn't that how we would all like to be remembered, as a good and decent person? You know, I'm 56. I think, as I said before, I'm a student of history, and I think that we can learn some things. And I remember standing out in the rain, and then probably was at the Martin Luther King, when Bobby gave the speech on the eve of Martin Luther King's death. And what he said, I think, holds true for me, what I believe in today, what he believed in then. And he said, what we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence or lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or black. And I'm sure today he would say Hispanic or Asian or whatever color or creed. Bobby had a way to end his speeches. You know, every politician that's out campaigning gives a stump speech. Reagan, for president, gives a stump speech, and the media get real tired of hearing it, but these people that follow him on all over, and they also want to know a key phrase, which means this is the end, get ready to head back to the press bus, because they're all always doing this. So Bobby's, I mean, and I listened to 25 of his speeches, and usually it always ended this way, but it was something that meant a lot to him and still means a lot to me. And he sort of lived by this credo that some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were, and say, why not? And I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent or whatever, but wouldn't it be great if all of our politicians, from whatever stripe of party, had that thought of things like that, and tried to work toward those ends. Those are just a few of the stories I have, and I hope I haven't bored any of you. And if I were, I don't know if you get grades, but I'll twist Dr. Kenny's arm to give you all an A just to sit through. I'll be happy to answer any questions, if anybody has any. Well, thanks for having me, Wally.
Does anybody have any relationships or stories they want to share
Sure.
with the candidates? It's not.
The World War II series, and I thought, why do we ever have this? Because it was such a terrific series. But I have to conclude that our first two sessions of this series are comparable to the World War II classes. I think Jerry Hoover and Mike have really been enthralling with their presentations. And I think it's going to be a real treat to have Senator Lugar. I'm not choosing up political parties, but when you get somebody who's running for the presidency in Rensselaer, I think you've achieved something. And it's quite an opportunity for the class members to go. And Jerry, tell us again the schedule. I think you said he'd probably be there right after lunch, if on schedule.
That isn't,
Never-
okay, that isn't in concrete, Wally. Supposedly, I'm supposed to know that tomorrow. But, and then I can't give you the schedule because everything is either backwards or forwards from Lugar, see? So he's like the 300-pound gorilla. Whenever he gets there, why, we're gonna let him do his thing, and then after that, why, it'll be backwards or forwards from there. And of course, it is also a little more difficult because we've got the time changes. About 2/3 of these schools are on the other time, and about 1/3 of them is on the time Rensselaer time. So it's going to be a little, it's going to take some scheduling and some things. But I think somewhere around noon. They're telling me, somewhere around noon that he'll be in Rensselaer. So
Well, we'll have it by next week, probably. We'll know by next
I
week.
would certainly hope so.
And we'll have it on the radio, and it'll be in the newspaper, and so you have that option, hopefully.
You have a question?
And nothing in the evening, it's all daytime or?
Yeah, he's just gonna be, another thing, the constraint on the students, we're talking about high school seniors. And so they have to get the buses back in order to take the kids home. And so I've guaranteed all the schools that they can leave school after school takes up and get back home before school lets out. So it's to get done what we gotta get done, it's gonna be pretty fast track.
Next week, Mike Riley and Kenny Call. See you then.